thanks to PLAE and Toomsy for having me. So 2015, I got the opportunity to go and work in Buffalo, New York, for the Buffalo Sabres in the NHL. I'd never watched a game of ice hockey, and after a month or two, the first real opportunity I was given to get my hands dirty, to actually do something for the team, was to do body composition measurements. I was an ISAC accredited practitioner, so I can take skin fold measures. And I remember seeing one player and thinking, wow, he's got a real beer belly. Well, look at the gut on him. And then when I came to measure him, his abdominals were actually really lean. And what I saw was, because he's an ice skater, his pelvis was tilted. So his body was like this. So his belly stuck out, but not with fat. It was just how his body had adapted to the demands of the sport, just like Rodri said earlier with the gymnasts. And that, for me, was a real light bulb moment of, okay, I'm dealing with different athletes here. Actually, all my experience so far has come in football, and that's a very homogenous group. Yes, there's variation within them, but I remember that moment of thinking, okay, I've got some biases here, I've got some assumptions that I need to set aside because I'm in a different sport. I then later on got the opportunity, as Toomsy said, to work for the Bills in the NFL. And I remember standing, watching in pre-season the conditioning test, and watching 90 athletes lined up, from guys who could maybe be training as sprinters and be in the Olympics, to guys who were literally three of me, and everything else in between. So again, another example of, right, I'm in a different world here now. And even here, you can see some of the players are wearing blue shirts and some are wearing white. Because in this sport, you have offensive players, you have defensive players, you have teams within the teams. But then you also have your players on special teams who go in between. So you have a third hybrid team. So by working in different sports, I had the opportunity to experience these different factors and really challenge myself to, what does that mean for my role as a sports scientist? We recently tried to put into a paper that just came out a couple of months ago. We wanted to highlight that actually our roles as practitioners differ depending on the sport you're working in. But we have to start with the context of that sport. So for instance, you're dealing with different numbers of players, different positions, different sizes of playing areas. Should we be tracking or measuring maximum velocity on a basketball court? Should we be tracking distance covered in the linemen? Should we be tracking distance covered in goalkeepers? It's really important to consider these different factors in a sport. And similarly, this was another figure from the paper talking about the time structures of different sports. So how do you treat a continuous sport differently to play-by-play? Do we still look at high-speed running per minute when actually it's a play-by-play sport where time is just a different factor? So I could speak for hours about the actual demands of the sports and the structures of the sports, but just really quickly, because I know people may not be familiar. American football now, as of last year, has a 17-game regular season. A couple of preseason games, but only 17 games. So you don't have many opportunities to have a bad game. If you make it to the playoffs, those are in January, then with the Super Bowl in early February. And then you have a really long off-season period. During that period, there is off-season training, which has just started now, mid-April, that goes till mid-June. 4 days a week, it's optional for the players, and then it builds to a mandatory week in mid-June. Contrast that with ice hockey. 82-game season, 3 to 4 games a week, lots of travel. The regular season ends in April time, but if you make the Stanley Cup finals, you could be playing through till June. And again, you could have quite a long off-season period there where you're not allowed to speak to your players. They can get in contact with you, but you cannot mandate or track them. And of course, then contrast that with perhaps what we're most comfortable with, 1 to 2 games a week in football or rugby across a much longer period of the year. So you basically have access to your players for the vast majority. That's on like the biggest picture, right? So let's zoom in perhaps to a week or so, a mesocycle. In football, maybe we're playing 2 games. We might have travel. This is an example from a few years ago where I think it was when Chelsea were in the Europa League. Okay, that's maybe worst case scenario. 3 away games across 8 days, got time zones. And then in ice hockey, traveling across North America, 3 or 4 games, changing time zones. And you may think, okay, well, the research tells us that we should, after a game, get a good night's sleep. Let's stay and let's travel the next day. Well, there are a lot of regulations in the American leagues. And so there are rules that actually often you have to travel straight after a game to arrive in the city the day before a game. So you'll play at 7 p.m. You might not land into that city until 3 a.m. and you've got another game that night. But as well as the regulations, culturally, that's the norm. The players do not sleep after games. So if you say, well, the research tells us that we need to get you guys to bed now, they're amped up, they can't sleep, but also that is not the norm for them. So blending the understanding of the rules with the understanding of the traditions and the cultures was a really big lesson. And then we've got American football. So only 1 game a week, but different time zones that you're dealing with. More decisions actually to be made around when should we travel? How long should we spend in a city? Especially now that there are actually a number of international games, London, Germany, and Mexico City. So context is key. And this was a paper that I was involved in where Stephen West interviewed 9 different team sport practitioners about how do we manage our players across different sports. And one thing that kept coming up is context. And you have lots of different examples there of contextual factors. And this isn't just now about different sports, right? This is the same environment, but different times of the year. How do you manage your players during pre-season versus later on in the season? Rodri talked again about the context with the young athletes. Obviously, as well with female athletes, we've got different unique contexts with the menstrual cycle and female health. So context is really important. And that's why not just working across different sports, but working across different environments and different time points in your own environment. I maintain that people often just want to transplant what they do for practice. They want to pick up what they did. I know it worked there, so I'm going to go into this new role and I'm going to do that there. But the complexity, the differing factors, the cultures, the different contextual pieces means that actually we have to translate our systems, not just transplant them. So for me as an applied sports scientist, I have always sat in between these different departments. And I know, many of you in the room may be strength and conditioning coaches or medical practitioners who more sit in one of these specific departments. But I think all of us here strive to use research, data, technology to support either our own decision-making or support others with their decision-making. And what are people making decisions on? So these are some of the key areas. Again, this is biased towards American sports. Some really interesting areas. Coaching is no longer just about coaching. It's all those decisions around managing your players. What time should we start in the morning? When should we travel? And then on the American sports side, the decisions as an organization around salary cap, around who you should draft. These are the areas. And we can start as practitioners with these questions. So again, for each area, these are some of the specific questions that our key stakeholders are trying to answer. And we can support them with objective information and recommendations. So how do I go about doing that? This is a paper I really love. This is Mark Rowe and a group from Ireland. And this is the framework that I have used in those teams and that I use now in my role as a consultant, helping teams deliver and develop performance solutions for their environment. So we have these 6 stages in this cycle, but also these themes of developing awareness, profiling, and then monitoring. Firstly, developing our awareness of injury trends and risk factors. Now, legally, we all collect, or our organizations all collect injury data. We have a legal duty to do so. But how many people are actually stopping to assess that injury information, because we need to be aware of the injuries that we're suffering. How does that compare to the norms in our sport? Are we suffering re-injuries? If we are, let's review all those cases. Let's review our rehab processes. If we're not, are we being too conservative? Are we not pushing our players enough in rehab? Because actually, we want to get our players back as soon as possible, and maybe we're not giving the coaches some of the game time that our players could have provided. So I think actually step one here is being aware of our own injury stats and what we're suffering and comparing that to norms. And then we want to understand the demands of our sport. And again, going into these sports completely blind with a beginner's mind was fascinating. And the greatest challenge in ice hockey was suddenly the fact that it was all on ice, obviously, right? But if I'm trying to transfer everything I know has come from land-based sports. So how does that actually translate to people skating on ice? We're collecting external load tracking data, but on ice, you can move, you can glide along the ice without having to actually put any energy into that movement, right? It's a result of the work you just put in. So how do we account for that in our data? How do we account for the fact that the device is between the scapula? Now, obviously, that has been researched in running-based sports and how that affects the data. But now suddenly we've got a lot of upper body involvement with shooting. So does that change how we're analysing the data? And then how we capturing the demands of fighting? I still don't know the answer to that one. And again, then with football and American football, and obviously having still 2D pictures does not capture these demands at all, doesn't do it justice. But I talked briefly about, okay, we've got two different teams, but then we've got a third team. How do we manage that? How do we track the demands for our linemen? How do we track the demands for our quarterback or our kickers? So we're constantly having to understand the demands of our sport and what that means for how we translate our knowledge and our research. And again, I think we've got people in here from cricket, and how do you deal with the differing formats of the game, but also the changing formats of the game. Now, the 100 was just introduced, so we need to understand the demands of that sport. So this is very relevant regardless of whatever sport you're in. And then we move on to the monitoring, the actual management of our athletes. And one of the things I've written about on my blog is thinking about this combination of value and burden, most value with the minimal burden. And then we need to translate that into our interventions. And from that same paper by Mark Rowe and colleagues, I like this approach, which I'm sure many of us do, in that, okay, there's some things that all our athletes get. Often, for instance, in American football, that is all our guys get the same warm-up because there's so many of them. And to any of you who've been to NFL games, you'll see that they all line up and the S&C coach got a whistle and they do the same thing. Just that is a logistical decision because there's so many people. But then we want to cluster various interventions, and whether that is clustering by position. So maybe our wide receivers and our skill guys are going to do Nordics, for example. But you know what? Our linemen aren't because of the differing demands, the differing injury epidemiology. Maybe that's the approach we take. And then we also sprinkle on top our individual interventions. So this then is an example of a report that we would create from our screening information. And again, I come back to the skill to be able to translate is essential to practitioners because we are translating the research and our knowledge to pick the most valuable tests and screening tools. We're then picking the most meaningful metrics from that, and we are translating that into interventions. And then we're also trying to translate it in a way that is meaningful to our colleagues and to the players themselves. So here we've tried to maximize the information, but also minimize the information on it. And ultimately, you come down to the bottom and it says, all of this for you means this and this. For you as an individual athlete, we recommend you do this program perhaps this recovery menu. It's collaborative. We work with athletes and understand their preferences, their traditions, their routines. And this is how we are translating it to the athletes. But we use a number of communication and intervention methods as well, because so many people test and the players never hear anything about that information. Well, here they had a book that is, this is what it means to you. This is what we recommend. And then just using different ways to educate and communicate. But it's not all down to the athlete. And this is another thing, concept I talked about on my blog, where this was a model, a concept more than a model, that was initially applied to human errors in accidents. Then it was applied to COVID-19. And here I try and apply it to injury risk by saying that all our interventions are like layers of Swiss cheese. They all have holes in them. Not one single thing is perfect. So we want to add layers of interventions on top of each other. But as you can see with the yellow boxes at the bottom, yes, some of those responsibilities fall on the athletes, but then some of them fall on the organisation as well. And that links in with this paper written by Phil Coles, where thinking about actually injury risk is an organisation-wide responsibility. The prehab programs and the S&C programs are a big piece of it, but actually the players that you're bringing in through the door is really important. Organisation to be able to have those uncomfortable conversations about the kinds of players they're bringing in and hopefully add objectivity to their process. Talking with the coach about the importance of loading, of recovery, to then hopefully get to a point where you can have an impact on that process. I think the biggest rock for recovery is your team schedule. The team calendar and how you design the days, the weeks and the days, I think is the biggest piece. And we would go back and forth on, should we train here? Should we have a recovery day? But then also we would go through minute by minute on a daily basis. Buffalo is a dark and cold place in the winter. And so what time should we get the guys in? How long should meetings be? Because in NFL, oh my word, the cognitive load from meetings is incredible. But the coaches need that. And you need to respect what they need to get across and what their needs are. You can't just say, let's take 30 minutes, let's not have that meeting. So that collaboration, understanding the context and coming together to try and build the best schedule, the best training plan for your specific environment is really important. And then we move into the monitoring piece because yes, okay, we'll end up deciding on a plan, but you've got to be constantly assessing to see how you need to adjust that plan. That is a big part of our role on a day-to-day basis. And so that paper I talked about at the beginning, where we were talking about the sport-specific analysis and how different it is depending on the context of the sport, well, actually, that was the second half of the paper. The first half of the paper, we talked about the overarching purposes of tracking data regardless of the sport, because there are similarities in what we can do and how we can use this information. And we felt that this tracking data allows us as practitioners to describe the demands, to plan and to monitor, but also all of that is constantly overlapping. You're describing the demands, you're planning for them, but then you're monitoring the guys and you're adjusting that. And we're doing that over a number of time frames, right? We've got our day-to-day, we've maybe got our long-term plan, we're looking at per minute, per drill, however detailed you want to get. All of this monitoring requires our tools where in practice, in our environment, we have to balance both the precision and the practicality. If you think about body compositions, perhaps the most precise methodology is DEXA. It's not very practical, and that's why skin fold calipers still are probably most commonly used because they have the best balance of precision and practicality. So with monitoring, an example of translating this in the environment, I kind of identified, okay, there's no internal load, we're just doing external load. So I had a conversation with the head of S&C, right, how about we do heart rate? The research tells us that's a valuable tool. And in our frank discussions, he said, Joe, we tried that, doesn't work for this, and this reason. That's not to say it would never work, but in having those conversations was like, okay, maybe in this environment at this time, it's not going to work for those reasons. And I said, okay, I listened to your feedback. How about we try RPE? And so we did that. And I felt that was just a good compromise of actually, let's find the best intervention for our environment. And similarly, if we think about our external load data collection, ideally, the players would all wear the vests. But if they've got a pouch in their shirt, but we can put the GPS in, before training, they don't even know it's there. So yes, we're compromising a little bit on the precision, but from a practicality standpoint, made a massive difference. Subjective response monitoring. So we use a questionnaire that the guys would fill in at their entrance. Again, would you ideally take it at the same time every day? We found this approach to be best. And then with your objective monitoring, I mean, I know the output guys would argue that their tool gives both precision and practicality, right guys? It's really important as practitioners to have that ability to know how to translate your solutions to your specific environment. And so again, I come back to this translation piece, and that actually we have to consider the time we have available with our players, the culture and the traditions of not just the sport, but maybe our specific team, and then all these other areas around what equipment do we have, what's the value and burden, as well as precision and practicality.